Welcome, and thank you for joining me once again as we journey through the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Today is a particularly interesting story where Jesus actually bumps into Moses and Elijah, who have been dead for many centuries. And so let's get into the text and see what the message is. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them high up on the mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, we will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Get up." He said, "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man will go to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. Fascinating story. To really get a grip on this story, you need to understand the Old Testament references. There's a whole lot of Old Testament stuff going on here that most Jews of the first century would have been very familiar with, but that often we are not. You have the story where Jesus takes his inner circle, the James, Peter, and John, up to the mountain, and they probably thought they were going up there to pray. Jesus did that a lot. And so they just thought, okay, we're going up there to pray. We'll go pray with Jesus. And these were obviously the 3 of Jesus' closest intimate disciples were James, Peter, and John. All of a sudden it says, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Now there again, we might think, wow, that's pretty cool, or hey, that's awesome. But to anybody in the Old Testament, they would know what's going on here. They would start to get the hint of what's happening. His face shining and his clothes becoming light are Old Testament references to the presence of Yahweh, of God. And so as Matthew's writing this story to predominantly Jews, his audience is mostly Jews, they would start to recognize, okay, if Jesus lights up like this, it's not just a luminary experience, but they're recognizing this indicates the presence of the God that they have served, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you got to wonder, what's with these Old Testament personalities suddenly popping up? Moses says, but you got to remember, Moses' face glowed after he had been in the presence of Yahweh. You remember the story there at Mount Sinai? He would go up on the mountain, he would go into the tent of meetings, and the cloud would come down, and he would come out, and his face would glow. It says he even put a veil over his face so people wouldn't see the glowing fade. But again, it was an indication that he had been in the presence of Yahweh. And here you have Moses and Elijah appearing side by side with Jesus. These two clearly represent the law and the prophets, which was a common reference point. If anyone was trying to make a point or argue theology, they talked about the law and the prophets. And Moses and Elijah definitely symbolized that whole Old Testament experience leading up to Jesus. And so they're here to remind Jesus. You sort of see Jesus is up on this mountain and he transfigures and he's talking with Moses and Elijah. You wonder, well, what's going on here? Well, they're there to remind him. They're there to sort of encourage him to do what he's supposed to do what God has called him to do what the whole Old Testament pointed to. The law and the prophets were all leading up to the Messiah coming and changing the world. And so they're there to sort of lift Jesus up, give him a boost of encouragement, and also impact the disciples that were following him. They're there to make sure Jesus is about to do something that is incredibly difficult. He knows. He's been telling his disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. And we know he's the Son of God, but we also know he was human, and the prospect of suffering and dying is not always a very positive thing. So I really see this as sort of an Old Testament personality encouragement for Jesus to follow through what's been prophesied for centuries, what the Jewish people and the whole world really had been waiting for. Jesus the Christ, the Messiah of God. And then you have this symbolism of the presence of Yahweh. I just think this is one of the coolest parts of this story, is that you have human contact with the divine. And it's pretty awesome, but you picked this up a long time ago. It says a bright cloud enveloped the disciples on top of the mountain. But you can remember back in the Old Testament with Moses leading the people out of Egypt, a luminous cloud led the Israelites by day through the wilderness. That's how they were able to know where to go to navigate. They didn't have, GPS or Google Maps. They had to just follow this cloud, and there was this luminous cloud that led the Israelites by day and a pillar of fire by night. And that's how they followed God, literally, by just following this luminous cloud, the presence of God. And then you had the bright cloud that settled on the tabernacle that we just talked about, where God spoke to Moses and his face would glow, and you had this luminous cloud that represented God's presence. And then you have this other story that a lot of people miss, the luminous cloud that settled on and filled Solomon's temple. When he dedicated his temple to God, again, this luminous cloud descended over the temple and filled the temple. So you could kind of see anyone who's familiar with the Old Testament is going to recognize Matthew's cues, Matthew's sort of narrative of this is the presence of God, except it's not Yahweh's part of it, but Jesus is also part of it. It sort of signifies that Jesus is the Son of God. Now you got to wonder, put yourself in the position of the disciples, what was going through their minds? They probably thought that, we're going to take a trip up here, we're going to do some praying, and then we'll come back down. And so they're not really expecting what's about to happen, which is pretty extraordinary. And, they were frightened at the appearance of Moses and Elijah, but they didn't appear to be blown away. You can sort of imagine by this time in Jesus' ministry, they've kind of gotten numb to the miracles. They've seen miracles all the time, the bread and the fish loaves to the thousands, and people being healed of blindness, and the lame walking, and the dead rising. They've sort of, the initial tingle and thrill and mind-blowing experience kind of has washed away. They know if you hang out with Jesus, you're going to see some pretty extraordinary things. So Moses and Elijah appear. It sort of gets their attention. I'm sure they thought it was pretty cool. These are characters they would have been studying about all their lives, and to actually see them interacting with Jesus, that would have been pretty cool. But they weren't terribly surprised. I mean, in spite of this divine act, they quickly go to worldly concerns and say, hey, we can build you tents, we can build you shelters. That's how you honored, someone who is deserving of honor. You honored someone special by placing a covering over them so they wouldn't have to deal with the direct heat of the sun during the day. And so they quickly, remember their manners. We got Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. We need to build some tents, some shelters for them so they can have a nice talk. which seems like a strange reaction to us, but I'm sure to them it was just common courtesy. In their confusion, they're offering to treat each of them with the same deference, a tent for each one. And you can imagine, they've been following Jesus for a long time, and I've often been asked, how do they know it's Moses and Elijah? Well, they would have greeted each other. They would have used each other's names. And so they're showing sort of an equal deference to these three great characters in their lives, two of which are historic, which seem to be talking to Jesus in front of them, and Jesus himself. In their minds, they probably thought it was quite an honor. You know, let's put Jesus right up there with Moses and Elijah. And from their upbringing, Moses and Elijah were the greatest heroes in Israelite history, and along with David and some others, of course, but these would have been the biggies. And so they're going to put Jesus right in there and treat him with equal respect and dignity that they would Moses and Elijah. The problem is, apparently Yahweh didn't feel like they were getting it. He thought they were missing the point entirely. That Moses and Elijah had showed up to encourage the Son of God. So what was God's point here? He says, hey, that's my translation, loose translation, but he says, this is my Son, whom I love. And with him I am well pleased. Listen to him. I think, they offer to build these three tents, and this cloud descends, and this voice speaks in such a way that it just knocks them to the ground. And I don't think God's trying to punish them, but he's certainly trying to get their attention that Jesus is not the same as Moses and Elijah. That you've got the law and the prophets, but you need to listen to Jesus. He's got a whole new twist on what it means to have a relationship with God. And though the law and the prophets are very valid authorities, very valid narrative words of God, Jesus is about to take it to a whole new level. And so the voice of God, the Father himself, comes down and lets them know, no, Jesus isn't just equal to Moses and Elijah. He's not just one of those guys. There's something much, much bigger going on here. Don't you dare place my Son on merely a human level. Moses and Elijah were great, but they're not divine. They're human. This is my Son. And any parent kind of understands how you feel about that. Don't you dare place him on the same level as the law and the prophets. This isn't just about his teaching trumps everything that's been said before. It's fairly consistent, but takes it to a new level. And there's that whole Sermon on the Mount where he said, you've heard that it was said, and he quotes the Old Testament, but then he goes on to sort of take the standards up a little bit higher as Christians. And so this voice is telling them, you guys don't get it. This is, my Son is way bigger. He was always part of the plan, and he's going to change the way you have a relationship with me. And so you need to listen to him above Moses and the prophets. That's his message. This is my Son. Listen to him. Now let's switch over from the perspective of the disciples. The miracles no longer surprise these three. Jesus transforming into light before their eyes definitely got their attention. Matthew's indicating it's the presence of God. And at the appearance of Moses and Elijah, they started to get a little frightened, but they quickly recovered and tried to honor them, tried to show proper respect. But when Yahweh, God the Father, showed up and spoke, they were knocked to the ground and terrified. At the presence of God, most human beings become extremely terrified. Not necessarily out of fear that you're going to be destroyed, but out of recognition of the great power that you are present in. I don't know if you've ever taken a tour of a nuclear power plant, but I had that same sense when I did that You're standing next to something that, if goes critical, could destroy, a 30 square mile area, and the radiation would destroy even more. Just standing next to that kind of power kind of makes you respect it a little bit more. And so this is God showing up. And when he talked, they hit the dirt. And I think he had their attention. Apparently Matthew remembered this incident that was related to him very well. But then they get back to the law of the prophets. Okay, Jesus comes up, wakes them up. He uses that standard greeting when God, when they realize they're dealing with God, people just get freaked out, and they always have to say, "Do not be afraid." When you get into the presence of God, that presence causes human beings. We recognize our sinfulness and his lack of sin. We recognize his greatness and our insignificance, his power, and we're powerless. And so every time an angel, or Jesus in this case, God shows up, he always has to, first thing out of his mouth, angel's mouth, whatever, don't be afraid. Because when you really realize you're dealing with the creator of the entire universe, a healthy amount of respect usually kicks in, if there's any wisdom within us at all. And then he tells them, don't say anything about this until after he's raised from the dead. And you often wonder, would they have said something? I mean, can you imagine them going down and just saying, "Hey, everybody, we just saw Moses and Elijah." I think most people would have thought they were crazy. And until they realized the significance that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God, no one would believe the other part. But now, as Matthew relates it, it's in light of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And it would have been quite believable at that point. They now knew he was the Son of God. But they knew all the prophecy said Elijah has to come first. And so they're asking Jesus, "Hey, what about the prophecy?" And Jesus has to explain to them, yes, he has to come first, and in fact, he already has. And they sort of finally understand he's talking about John the Baptist, was the herald before the king coming. He was the one who came and announced the coming of the Messiah, the Son of God. And he was put in prison and beheaded. And Jesus is telling them, and the same thing's going to happen to me. And I imagine they're still having trouble with that. How can it be that the Messiah, the Son of the living God, could be killed by men? But they had a little more growing and maturing to do in their understanding of who God is and what he's all about. So what's the call of action in here? I think there's some basic lessons we need to pick up on. We must never get so caught up in Jesus' humanity that we forget that he's divine. And I see people doing this all the time. We want to make Jesus human, and the fact is he was. He was fully man and fully God at the same time. But if he gets too human, he loses some of his divine impact and significance. And so we need to always remember he was totally human, but he was divine also. At the same time, we've got to never get so caught up in his divinity that we forget he was human and that he understands our temptations. One of the greatest theological significance of that is on the final judgment day, when we stand before the throne of God, no one's going to be able to look at God and say, "You don't understand what it was like to be human. You're God." And there'll be Jesus standing right there who knows exactly what it's like to be human. So no one's going to be able to throw that in God's face as if, we couldn't help it. Jesus fully experienced our humanity while remaining completely divine at the same time. He will be the ultimate interpretation of our actions when we stand before God on that final day. We are called, and this is directly out of the text, we are called to listen to the words of Jesus and to put them into action in our lives. Now, I know a lot of folks who seem to prefer reading the letters of the New Testament reading through Acts instead of the Gospels. There are some denominations that completely focus on all the letters following the Gospels to use for doctrinal patterns and for methodologies within the church. But what a lot of people don't realize is all of those letters are taking the Gospels, the words of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and applying it to those particular churches' contexts, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, that the letters are applying the words of Jesus. The apostles who wrote them Luke, the author, they wrote these thinking, okay, here's what Jesus said. Now, what does that mean in this context? And what does that mean in this context? And the contexts are different, but the words and the spiritual principles remain the same. We're called to listen to the words of Jesus and put them into action, to apply them in our lives. Otherwise, his father can become angry. And as the old saying goes, you won't like him when he's angry. As long as we're listening to Jesus, as long as we are glorifying the Son of God and becoming more and more Christ-like, his Father and ours will be pleased and proud of us. But it's when we reject his words or simply ignore them that a parent can get pretty upset. And it's one thing to upset a parent, it's another thing to upset the creator of the universe. Now, God loves us like a father, and I think that's one of the greatest images. If we understand that he is our father, then we don't have to be afraid of him. But like with all of our fathers, who we may or may not have had a close relationship with, but in my case, where you do love your father, but the only time you became fearful was when you ignored or rejected what they told you to do. We're called to listen to Jesus, to obey the Word of God, and to glorify God in our lives, in our words, in our churches, and in our interactions with all human beings, neighbors, co-workers, whatever. People need to look at us and see the great God within us so that his name will be glorified. Thank you for joining us today.